Hello ladies and gentlemen, this is Philosophossum, and this is going to be part 2 in a series of videos in which I respond to comments made by a guy named Hariot. In the last video I went over some general logical fallacies I noticed he uses frequently. In this video I'm going to be discussing his views regarding natural rights and the non-aggression principle. Let's get into it. So I figured I'll start off this video with some contextual information so that you understand the problem at hand. The idea of natural rights has to do with a long debate in moral philosophy between what's known as moral subjectivism and moral objectivism. So moral subjectivism is the idea that right or wrong is a matter of opinion, is relative, or is in one form or another contingent upon something. Anyone who's familiar with the logical positivists of the 20th century, such as A.J. Ayer and Bertrand Russell, will probably be familiar with this line of reasoning. Right or wrong is basically a matter of opinion. The only reason murder is wrong is because people don't like it, is basically the line of reasoning here. Now there are a lot of problems with this point of view. As a matter of fact, I could probably just make a whole video dedicated to just discussing all the problems with moral subjectivism, but I think the biggest one is this. If morality is subjective, then it basically has no teeth. Here's what I mean by that. Suppose somebody wants to kill you for whatever reason. In your opinion, murder is wrong and this person shouldn't do that. However, that person is A-okay with it and sees no problem with it whatsoever. Well, if morality is ultimately subjective, their justification for killing you is equally valid as your justification for not being killed, because at the end of the day it's all just a matter of opinion, right? If somebody wants to steal something or rape somebody, well, all they have to do is have the opinion that theft and rape is okay, and you have basically no logical basis to counter it. So if morality is subjective or ultimately a matter of opinion, it's ultimately toothless. Now granted, there are other problems with moral subjectivism, but that I feel is the biggest one. Now the opposite of moral subjectivism would be moral objectivism. As opposed to moral subjectivism, which claims that what's right or wrong is a matter of subjective opinion, moral objectivism, on the other hand, claims that what's right or wrong are actually matters of demonstrable fact that can be proven objectively. This is the point of view taken by people like John Locke and Immanuel Kant, and also most libertarians. It's also much more of a logically solid viewpoint to take. If morality is ultimately a matter of provable fact rather than subjective opinion, then morality is no longer arbitrary. There's some sort of backing behind it. There's some objective and universal standard by which human action can be evaluated, and you no longer have that loophole where someone can just be like, I decide murder is okay, so I'm just going to do it. Now, the interesting thing to know about Donald is that he claims to believe in natural rights. I don't really believe him though, for 3 reasons in particular. The first reason is that he primarily makes utilitarian arguments. So anyone who's familiar with Jeremy Bentham or John Stuart Mill will probably be familiar with the idea of utilitarianism, also known as consequentialism. Called this because it puts emphasis on the consequences of a particular course of action. Utilitarianism basically determines what's right or wrong by focusing on what actions will produce the best results, as opposed to deontology, which is a theory of ethics that focuses on what rights people have. Now, one of the things that this guy did that frustrated the crap out of me was that he would claim to be a deontologist but make primarily utilitarian arguments. Anytime you'd see this guy make a moral argument, he'd primarily appeal to the consequences, and seldomly would he say anything about people's rights. For example, in this comment here, he makes the claim that extortion is justified as a matter of convenience. There's no possible way to justify that point of view deontologically. That is a utilitarian argument. Now, my goal here isn't necessarily to criticize utilitarianism, but the idea that utilitarianism is compatible with natural rights. In order to have a purely consequentialist theory of ethics, you have to necessarily disregard other people's rights. And we can see him basically doing that. Anytime someone would bring up the issue of rights in an argument, he would scoff it away and say, well, look at the results or consequences we need to accomplish. And it would be different if, say, he was weighing the benefits we'd get from these results against, the fact that this violates people's rights. But what he's doing is he's focusing exclusively on the results and not taking the rights into account at all. For example, in this comment here, notice the part where he says, I don't care how you got your business. Well, see, the thing is, if you believe in natural rights, then you believe people have a right to the fruit of their time, labor, hard work, risks, etc. Problem is, this guy's basically denying that and just focusing on the consequences that he deems justified. Now, of course, he does raise a valid issue. What if these businesses are operating in a way that causes harm to other people or society around them? Now, if this guy actually did believe in natural rights the way he says he does, the discussion would be more along the lines of how do we reconcile these two competing interests, the right of the business owner to operate as they please and the right of society not to be harmed. Now look at this comment here from a different user. This person is acknowledging that business owners have a right to operate their business as they please, they have a right to do business, but at the same time those living in society around the business also have rights as well, and those rights can be violated if the business is operating in a way that's harmful. So rather than pretending that business owners don't have a right to their business, this person takes a more intellectually honest approach and says, how can we balance the right of the business owners to their business with the other interests of society? Now granted, I still disagree with this person's conclusion that this necessitates state intervention, but I feel this is a much more intellectually honest approach, and it's much more in line with natural rights because it does take into account the business owner's rights, and doesn't, just pretend like they don't exist for the sake of convenience. Another claim this guy makes is that taxation should not be voluntary because if it was, the dollar would have no value. This is an incredibly idiotic argument, which I will be tearing apart in another video. Again, my focus in this video isn't to criticize the argument in and of itself, but rather the idea that the person can hold this conclusion while still believing in natural rights. Assuming that this were true, that without forced extortion, the dollar would have no value. Well, if this person does believe in natural rights the way he says he does, then the conclusion to draw would be the dollar is inherently immoral, we should replace it with a different currency not based on coercion. He doesn't draw this conclusion, however. He says, yeah, let's keep threatening people with violence to maintain the value of the dollar. As a matter of fact, not only is this viewpoint inconsistent with the idea of natural morality, but it also commits a very common fallacy in moral reasoning, and that is the is therefore ought fallacy. That's basically when you look at the way something works and assume that because it works that way means that it has to work that way. Now again, I do plan to criticize this specific argument in detail in another video. For now, all you need to know is that this is another point against him believing in natural rights. Now this of course doesn't mean that you can't be a deontologist and make utilitarian arguments. You can believe in natural rights and make arguments as to what course of action would lead to the best outcome in any situation. But if you're going to argue for deontology or natural rights, you have to, take those rights into account, not just pretend they don't exist when it's convenient for you. So the second reason I don't really believe this guy when he says he believes in natural rights is that he outright says things that contradict the idea of natural rights. So in my last video, if you remember, I mentioned that this guy has the consistency of water. His arguments are all over the place. And if you recall the definition of moral objectivism, the idea that morality is something that exists naturally and can be proven objectively, well, he makes several arguments that outright contradict that very concept. So according to this guy, the only reason I have a right to use force in self-defense is because the government basically says I can. Well, that pretty much is the exact opposite of what natural rights entail. If I have a right to do something, I don't need government to give me permission to do it, I can just kind of do it. As a matter of fact, not only does this argument go against the concept of natural rights, it goes against the concept of rights. If somebody else has to give it to you, if it's contingent upon somebody else's permission, then it's not a right, it's a privilege, like by definition. Another example is this little tidbit here where he asks, without democracy or elected representatives or whatever, how do you think laws would be created? Well, the thing is, if rights exist naturally, then laws don't really have to be created, they just kind of exist. And a final one that I think really seals the deal here is that this guy argues that every society has its own objective standard of morality, and as Brian rightfully calls him out on it, if something is contingent upon the society, then it's not really objective. I could really go on and proving all the different ways this guy doesn't believe in objective morality, but I can't think of any more solid evidence than him outright saying he doesn't. The final and biggest reason I don't believe him is that he quite simply just doesn't have any principles. Here's what I mean by that. In order to believe in natural rights, you do have to explain where they come from. You can't just assert that they exist. Now, Donald asserts that all kinds of rights exist. He asserts that positive rights exist, rights not to be discriminated against or to be harassed or whatever, all exist. The problem is, at no point does he ever give an in-depth demonstration as to how they exist. He just asserts that they do. So now, what if I came up to you and told you that unicorns or monsters or fairies exist? Without providing any sort of proof or explanation, I just went up to you and assert that, yeah, they exist totally. I'd imagine you wouldn't be too inclined to believe me. That's because simply asserting that something exists on its own is pretty much useless. If you want to actually demonstrate something exists, you have to substantiate it somehow. Now, of course, Donald claims that the best way to do this is through democracy. Democracy is the process by which society discovers what our natural rights are. The problem with this is that democracy democracy isn't a scientific process. There's no objective logic behind it. It's basically a winner-take-all system. You can't necessarily take a vote on whether the earth is flat or round, or the temperature at which water boils, because democracy is more a measure of popularity than truth. Another problem I foresee with this is something called the Euthyphro Dilemma. And for those of you who don't know, that comes from Greek philosophy. It comes from one of Plato's dialogues where he talks about the trials of Socrates. Basically what happens is Socrates asks Euthyphro, hey, what does piety mean? And Euthyphro responds by saying, well, something is pious if the gods decide it's pious. So then Socrates asks, how do the gods decide what's pious? And Euthyphro gives him some sort of an explanation, I forget the details. But the main thing that Socrates points out is that Euthyphro's answer indicates that there's some sort of logic or process by which we can determine the piety of something independent of the opinion of the gods. In other words, the decision or opinion of the gods don't really add anything to the issue. So you kind of run into the same problem here when you claim that democracy is how we determine our rights. Whatever sort of logic or thought process the majority uses, or a person trying to influence the majority uses, could in theory exist and be valid independent of the opinion of the majority. And at that point, adding democracy to the equation doesn't really add anything of substance. Further making his process unscientific is the idea of government having a monopoly on force, or advocating the use of force. The reason he believes government should have a monopoly on force is because he thinks if everyone was just free to determine what right and wrong was for themselves, then there's no way we could have an organized society. Now, here's the problem with that, at least in terms of the belief in natural rights. If something really is objectively provable, then it's independently verifiable. That is, that anyone, anywhere, going through the same epistemological process will arrive at the same conclusion. For example, when scientists want to prove something, what they do is they set up an experiment, and not only do they document the results of that experiment, but they document the procedure they went through to set up that experiment as well. Now, the reason they do this is that so any other laboratory can verify their results. If their process was scientific and holds logical weight, then any other laboratory anywhere would be able to set up the exact same experiment and get the exact same results. Suppose, however, that one laboratory declared itself to have a monopoly on science, and anyone was prohibited from setting up similar experiments to theirs. You just had to kind of accept their results on face value. Well, what if that laboratory made a mistake when they set up their experiment? Or what if they set up the experiment right, but they drew the wrong conclusions? You'd have no way of knowing. You see, independent verifiability is a very important part of science and reasoning. And the fact that he doesn't show any confidence that his moral principles can be independently verified, the fact that he feels government needs a monopoly on doing this, tells me that he's not too confident in the logic behind his moral arguments. So if not through democracy or a monopoly on force, how is it exactly that we determine what our natural rights are? Join me on my next video where we go into detail on his arguments regarding the non-aggression principle. Until next time, this has been Philosophossum, making stupidity play dead. Have a good one.